thank you so much for that and for the opportunity to be with you here today. Thanks also to Stephen and the organizing committee. This is a more heterogeneous mix of industry, academia, nonprofits, the works than I've ever, I think, participated in. So it's a great inspiration to be with all of you today. I wanted to explore two basic themes. The work that we've been seeing today, representative of my understanding of a lot of work in virtual reality and AR, tends to be, in my opinion, very eye-biased, what we can see, new ways to see. But I suspect every one of you is at least as attached to your hands, and your feet, and probably some other objects in the physical world, as you are to your eyes. And if you were to play a musical instrument, prepare food, or do almost anything that you do with your body other than computing, you would find yourself that the ability just to click or to point has great powers but great limitations as well. And so hopefully I'll be exploring some other kinds of ways of giving physical form to digital things, in some senses, how that could be relevant to the VR, AR, and other kinds of systems that we're exploring. And if you believe in any aspect of that, I think one of the other things that's exciting is there are a whole lot of additional people that can join the party and contribute with their skills, not just coders and not just creators of virtual content, but people who are good with their hands, good at building things, good at engaging in a lot of different aspects of the world, who all become at least as interesting contributors as people who like code or like Illustrator or the such. So I joined Clemson last year as the chair of our human-centered computing division. Some of you are familiar with that phrase, others less so. To a first approximation, everything you've seen today, to me, is a great example of human-centered computing. There is computing that doesn't involve humans, and human activities that doesn't involve computing. But there's a big and growing intersection, a lot of halo around that, and that's what this collection of 9 folks that I get the pleasure of working with study. Of those folks, 3 of them really focus on virtual reality, virtual environments, sometimes notions of avatars, sometimes human-driven, sometimes computationally driven, a lot of basic studies of perception, studies of vocational applications, medical applications, and beyond. You've also seen some of the workforce development activities. Stephen has been piloting some work bringing VR to the classroom in different forms. And so when I was asking Stephen for his sense over lunch, he and I thought there are at least 12 faculty at Clemson who spend a lot of their waking hours thinking about VR, probably another 50, 30, 40, 50 who are really excited about bringing these sorts of technologies to the classroom. And many of you have been present today, and you know folks who are in that category. So you'll notice also that I don't list myself among the members of that group. I first joined a VR lab in 1991 at the University of Illinois, NCSA, and did some work as a postdoc in that. But the theme of my work, for the most part professionally, is looking at this intersection between bits and atoms, thinking about new ways to physically embody, physically engage with computation in different sorts of ways. Some of that involves VR-like systems, some of it doesn't yet, but wants to. These are a couple just different examples along the way. So in postdoctoral work, we're trying to think of better ways both to interact with colliding black holes, leading to the LIGO results in the last Nobel Prize for Physics. But also, the moment you've done that, those are interesting tools in the medical context, both for medical doctors and for patients and others. Navigating historical landscapes. I'll give another example of that in a moment. We built a system for sort of with a large panoramic display, and at first we only had a mouse. And so a lot of the people who would come visit would look at it and look at that landscape and would say, you want us to do what with that, to do what? We'll show you another couple examples of that in a moment. But going back, I guess one other example. So this idea of tangible interfaces. In some ways, it's very old. There are amazing examples in the mid-70s, but even this week is a pretty interesting week. So just on Monday, there was an announcement from Microsoft. It's not yet a product, but it was sort of a product preview of a toy-oriented sort of mat that can sense a few dozen NFC tags, so you can have objects, it knows where they are, where they're pointing, where you're touching the mat, where your hands are above the mat. And not surprisingly to most of you, many of their applications were thinking with a HoloLens, when you've got that output-rich capability, isn't it interesting to think about input-rich capabilities? And we like to think of it not just as input and output. Those objects there at some level provide a path for input, but they're really representations, and they're kinds of outputs, and passive haptic outputs, and you can combine them with things that make them move around on their own accord, and then they become very active outputs. So a lot of technologies that have been percolating for many decades, but in the Microsoft press release, where they're trying to pitch their own wares, the last sentence is, it gives people reason to believe that maybe the time has come to really get a lot more adventurous for using ensembles of physical objects as ways to interact with computation. But I also thought it was interesting to go back a while. Jaron Lanier is sometimes coined with, or credited with coining the phrase virtual reality. Probably many people contributed to that. In 2004, plus or minus, he sort of looking to David Letterman, and he says Spinal Tap. I don't know anything about that or what that came from. The top 11 reasons VR has not yet become commonplace. Now, again, 2004 has come and gone, but I like to look at those and say, which of those problems have we solved? And which of those are works in progress? And which do we seem near solving, and which may take us a little bit while further? And so number 9, he says, because the basic ideas of VR still need some more work. And so you could have the opinion that we've solved that it's, putting smartphones and other things on our head and using 1 or 2 mice or hand gestures in the air. But again, I gave you the sense that my sense, and I think other people's sense too, is that's a fabulous place to start, and for a lot of things it's adequate, but it would be unfortunate if you stopped there, if you didn't think what might come further. And then there's, again, this sort of notion, at least in 2004, there's not yet a clear sense where VR fits into the time and space of our lives. That one is my favorite. And again, things have evolved considerably, because at that point, maybe you really needed the $1 million room, and you didn't have a budget to afford a lot of them. And we see that people can ad hoc set things up in an hour or so, or whip out their phone in a couple minutes to do something. But I think at a deeper level, there are still, in my opinion, at least as many questions, maybe more so today, than there were then. And so I was thinking, as we're all, in almost every one of these talks, looking backwards and forwards at the same time, if we look forward 5 years, 10, 15, 50, one notion, a persistent perception, I think, in a lot of people's heads, was one in 1991 when I joined a VR lab, still today, that it has something to do with goggles, right? There's another sort of generalization of that. What if we were to take not glasses, but glass? So a number of us are wearing glasses, and so we know something both in an augmented and a virtual reality. What if we bring that to life? There's some glass in some other places, in our phones, here, others. What if we think about waking all of that glass, or much of that glass, in different ways to a possibility of mediating, whether that's sort of magic mirror sorts of glass or magic lens sorts of glass, all of those and become interesting. But then you could also go another step further, and you could start looking at surfaces. I see here, and in most buildings I interact with, a lot of naked walls. And on the one hand, it's not bad to have walls that aren't competing for our attention, but you look at that canvas and you think about other ways you could design space and say, is there anything other than nakedness that wall might want to have someday, even to support augmented reality, VR sorts of things? If I'm blinding myself, potentially, by putting something on my face, the more I can do to feel something, the more affordances. Or if I'm doing an AR element, some aspects of this room change from meeting to meeting, but others, the purpose of the building, the mission here, at some level that persists. And if you can complement, afford that, weave that into the walls and the floors, that seems to me interesting. But there's a danger to that as well. So I'm going to go back, I think, before any of our time. I don't know, how many of you have heard of the Vinylite House? Anyone? Not that many of us who attended the 1933 World's Fair, though I think it was like 15, 20 million. There was an insane number of people who actually went there. It's just amazing. It hasn't been replicated since. And so in the Vinylite House by Union Carbide, a company perhaps known in other ways today, everything was of plastic. a revolutionary idea at the time. And in this, one of my favorite books called American Plastic, there's this assertion that it was colorful and interesting, but when plastic used frankly and directly became the overwhelming material, maybe it became a bit cold and inhuman. And so to me, if I think about the possibility of having every wall, every surface be a black mirror, there are aspects of that that are interesting, but at least as many aspects that suggest that's not necessarily where I would choose for myself, for my 4-year-old to spend all of our waking hours and days of our lives. And so again, to me, I said also, let's remember not only that, but this notion of crap. How many of you have heard about crap as a design heuristic? So first a random undergrad and then the director of the School of Art, my previous institution, came with this assertion that good design is full of crap. Contrast, repetition, alignment, proximity. And one of many generalizations I like to think about that, they were thinking of that in the terms of two-dimensional graphics and contrast with color, with space, etc. But since a lot of what I do is to build physical things, there's also physical contrast, wood with aluminum. If you can have an object that's all plastic, or you can start mixing it up. Mixing it up often has a lot of virtues. And again, in physical spaces, if you can think about it as all virtual, or again, weaving some virtual with physical. That's my business to sell that, but I think that at least on first principles, bringing contrast, this sort of weaving of the virtual and physical, has a number of interesting potentials. And so to me, one perspective, again, looking forward, is yes, to keep all of what's good and interesting about what's happening here, but again, to think about new ways to weave more stuff and more spaces into that which we do. And so while the books, doors, and halls are a bit of a new exercise for me, some of this started a couple of years ago. I went to dinner with my advisor, my doctoral advisor, for the first time in a number of years. And his first question to me, I was 36, I think, at the time, was, Brygg, how do you want to be remembered when you die? And he's Japanese, and I thought, I don't think, it's not a typical sort of first question. And then the next morning, someone else said to me, Brygg, we'd like to have a feature article as long as it has nothing to do with anything you've done in the past 20 years. I thought, okay, that's also not a typical question. But in the next month or two, we had this 90-year-old dorm building that was our center's home. We were about to move into a new one, and we started to take that very flexible space and think about reskinning it. And at that particular time, and for a lot of my last 15 years, I had 4 buildings that I was equally responsible for inhabiting. Offices in 2, labs in 2, and I always found that difficult to be 90% of my time in each of 4 different spaces. And so we started taking the walls and looking at the edges, and what if we took people up at the top and themes? So what you can barely see at the top is a bit of the cloud, some elements representing our publication activity, our grant activity, other sorts of things. We were linking that to our Dropbox box, actually it's Subversion, SVN repositories, and anytime things were being committed, trying to weave back in cloud space into the physical world. And for the physical bodies as well, this was again a super early sketch, but physically, where am I? And virtually, where am I? At that case, it was just looking at Google Calendar. But if I'm going to be in a lot of different places and we're trying to schedule intercepts, if, at least for our workplaces, the most important objects of interest are the people and the work, is there a way to somehow externalize that? And whether you're using the LEDs that you sort of virtually actually woven in, or you're thinking about looking at that through your fancy glasses of the future, or your phone, are there some interesting potentials? So we actually brought that to life in some fashion, but we found there were a lot of moving parts. And so especially as we went on beginning to simulate that in some form, to think, what do we really want to build before we start putting 1,000 Raspberry Pis and 10,000 LEDs in it? I'm not going to say a lot about the details there. More than that, maybe can you start really inhabiting it? So a proposal that Steve and I and some others have pending at the National Science Foundation is sort of a very flexible space. What if you have a few dozen displays? But the notion that those displays like to walk around on their own and reconfigure themselves. This came actually, I'd noticed a trend for the last 6 or 7 years a lot of the Japanese and Scandinavian publications I was seeing somehow involved robotic furniture. And I thought, well, if the couch can wander around and do different sorts of things, why not the displays? Isn't it a limited way to think that the best configuration for displays is always 2 or 4 of them lined up on a wall all in the same place? It's actually my wife's idea. She was saying I was being very, very conservative. Can we start thinking about sometimes they want to be in a circle, as the cave 2 might be. Sometimes they want to box you in. Sometimes they want to simulate that hallway. Let's just line them up that way. And for the moment, what we're trying to say is, can we design a system that a single undergrad in 10 minutes between meeting sessions of the room can reconfigure? And if that works out well, then we'll start adding the robots to let them mid-meeting, mid-conversation, be able to reconfigure in different sorts of fashions. This one I actually have to blame on Stephen as well. So as we were beginning to think about this idea about spaces, I was given these 2 project assignments 20 some odd years ago, and I've sort of never quite finished them. One of them, how many of you are familiar with the notion, Japanese notion of a genkan? Any of you? So in most Japanese spaces, I think, not supermarkets, but homes, places of worship, businesses, there's sort of the outside doors and the inside doors. And mechanistically, you're going to take your shoes off. And that's both about keeping the physical dirt out, but also the spiritual dirt out. It's sort of this place of separation. And so all of us were assigned to build a genkan between the physical and the digital world. Had to be physical, but was about that sort of passage. We were also asked to build some magic books. And so I began sort of spinning about doors, and Stephen had the really world-changing sort of notion. There's this nice patch of underutilized real estate out there that doesn't know what it wants to be when it grows up. As long as we're going to build a Stargate to some different sets of physical and virtual spaces in the universe, why not give ourselves a little bit larger palette and a field to sort of grow into? And so again, one of the many different notions, yes, we're beginning to envision that in VR, weaving a few hundred servos into that so that I can move with the activity in Dominica and in Berlin and all the other places of our collaborations, move with our different virtual activities. But this sort of synergistic, wanting to simulate some of that in VR to sell to different people before they allocate us the fields, virtually or physically for a week or a year or a decade. But also imagining that maybe when it grows up, it still wants to be virtual, right? That a lot of how people experience it might be, especially in future decades, through their magic glasses. Stephen was saying, and it was exactly true when we were seeing your obelisk. I almost took a Google SketchUp and began sort of laying out the groundwork below it. How would you want to interact with it? And what stories as a lens, as a prism, as a Stargate? Stargate's my favorite sort of notion is actually from Chaucer, that from the Wives of Bath meets Forrest Gump. Wives of Bath, the paraphrase of Old English is handsome is as handsome does. Forrest Gump, you remember, stupid is as stupid does. So I figured that both Stargates are as Stargates do, and tangibles are as tangibles do, if it's going to function to connect you to some remote space. Just as someone said with VR, you don't necessarily want to walk in the center of a Coney nuclear reactor. So the Stargate doesn't literally take you there, but if it's even better than being in the middle of the reactor, right? And giving you the handholds to understand that, experience that in different ways, that strikes me as having some potential. So there you've seen a little bit of halls, a little bit of doors. Even with books, there's this old sort of accordion type of book. And so where you were seeing with this 15 years ago when we were building this, taking many $1,000s worth of tracking sensors and things to build the dedicated table to a UNESCO World Heritage Site. What if we can start thinking about many or most of our books? Back 50 years ago, if you wanted color in a book, you had this notion that there'd be a few expensive color plates in the center, and then a bunch of regular paper on the outside. And so to me today, I say, sometimes get rid of the regular paper. That's what your tablet or your phone will do. But hang on to the idea of the few expensive plates. This table of contents that, especially if you're electing to be blind, if you're electing to put on something that doesn't then at least give yourself something to feel with your hands that can guide your hands and push back in different sorts of ways. And now, every time I start seeing graphics, this is from the Gates Foundation, map their face to everything they do in the United States, actually, 15% of their portfolio, I think. What if we can start lifting that up into 3 dimensions and making that, again, some form of interactive graphic? And we've got a number of variations on that, not all of which are done now with felt, but so on and so forth. So in closing, again, I like goggles and I like eyes. And I love all of the work being done here today. What I'm saying is not at all contrary to or poking at that, but it's trying to also talk about this great opportunity that awaits all of us. Especially even, again, all of our phones have the ability with their multi-touch to set something on it and become a mini multi-touch sensor for objects as well as hands. And so across the spectrum, this opportunity and imperative for weaving in the physicality with the virtuality in its many different forms of and additions. A lot of this is early steps in my first year at Clemson, but thrilled to be with you and looking at the next decade or few together. I don't know if there's any moments for questions, but there it is.
Do we have any questions for Brygg? Can you apply any kind of metric to your work
Metric to the work to assess it is a fabulous question, and I think there are several answers to that. In my division, almost all of the other faculty have a deeply evaluative perspective to what they do. I have to keep confessing that when I looked at the 40 or so faculty that were at MIT's Media Lab that I was getting mentorship from, most of them weren't really into that business, and so I was probably insufficiently trained. What I keep reminding myself also is the incredible opportunity of being newly arrived at Clemson when I have all of these people who know very much more about that, is to work with them. And so we're really pushing as hard as we can to get the systems that are worthy of evaluation, trying to sort of converge, if we're going to have many different sorts of editions of this, to things that are just simple enough to make work with present technologies, that we can start getting feedback in different sorts of ways. So some of these have been evaluated, and a lot of the work I've done has been in collaboration with real-world applied people doing hardcore applied genomics, which is one of the things I spend a lot of my life with. And so while we haven't started evaluating it that way formally, we're using it on a production basis, and so it's wanting to be evaluated soon. So that's a very long and wordy way of saying that wants to come very soon now. Hasn't been the dominant mode behind a lot of what's there, but is a large part of its future.
Thank you very much, Brygg.
Thank you.